All right, we've talked about the social, economic, and religious backgrounds of everything leading up to the time of the Messiah, the coming of Christ. Now we're going to look at the political situation, the developments in the political realm, because they're going to have a great impact upon not only what happens during the Gospels when Jesus is alive and involved in his ministry, but following that as well. And in order to do that, we need to back up to where we were before. Remember before we talked about the Maccabean revolt? Hopefully that sounds familiar to you. Yes? All right, so remember that took place here in Jerusalem and Judea area. The Maccabees, named after the son of Mattathias, who is essentially standing against Zeus, because Antiochus Epiphanes wanted to establish Greek religion, Greek customs, ways of doing things, and Mattathias, of course, refused to cooperate, and his stepping in to prevent sacrifice of a pig from occurring is what kindled the revolution. And you know that once they were successful recapturing Jerusalem, that they attempted to rededicate the temple and everything in it, and ran into a problem in that in order to rededicate the temple, they had to burn the menorah for 8 days, but they only had enough oil for how long? One day. And in order to get more oil consecrated to put into the oil lamp, the menorah, they had to have a temple rededicated. So it was a catch-22. They couldn't do either one. So they decided we'll just do the best we can, put the 1 day oil in the menorah, and how long did it burn?
8 days.
8 days, good. And that led to what celebration of the Jewish people from then on? They celebrated what? Hanukkah. We call it Hanukkah today, or they called it the Feast of Dedication as well, or the Festival of Lights, because it has to do with light in the menorah. Okay, that shows candles there, which really isn't the case. They were oil lamps. All right, so remember all that. And you also remember, hopefully, that Mattathias' sons were involved in the war, and eventually, at the end of it, his son Simon is the one who became a prince to rule over the area of Israel now that had been captured, taken away from Antiochus Epiphanes, from the Greeks, forever, taken away from them. All right, so in your notes that we start with Simon here. Simon is the brother of Judas, who the Maccabees are named after, Judas Maccabeus, the second son of Mattathias, who started the whole thing. So we're going back to here. Simon takes over, and this is a time of conquest and expansion. As Simon rules, he expands the rule of Israel, conquers other areas around. He assumed the office of high priest and established that their family would have that forever until the faithful prophet appeared. Those they're waiting for the prophet that Moses had predicted to come. In other words, the Messiah to come. And so he functioned as high priest as well as ruler. They had no prophets to tell them what to do, because who was the last prophet? Who was the last Old Testament prophet? What's the last book of the Old Testament? Malachi. They hadn't had a prophet in hundreds of years, and so they don't know exactly what to do, so they're doing what they can. Simon called together a great assembly of leaders, out of which the Sanhedrin would arise. And hopefully you're familiar with the Sanhedrin that appears in the Gospels. The aristocratic party, the Hellenizers, that were on the side of Antiochus Epiphanes, but then came over to the winning side of the Maccabees, the Hasmonean family, excuse me, constituted a majority of the assembly. So even though they were fighting against Hellenism, when they established an assembly of leaders, it was those that were for Hellenism that had most of the seats. That doesn't make sense, does it? But that's what happened. And then they elected Simon as high priest. Unfortunately, Simon was poisoned while visiting his son-in-law near Jericho. So that leads us to his son, John Hyrcanus. I've duplicated the family tree here so that you can follow along as we go. So here's Simon, and then here's his son, John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus expanded the kingdom even further, including the areas of Transjordan. Trans means what? Like a transportation or transgression. Trans has the idea of what? Not for. Transgression is what? You have a line and you cross it. Transportation is you're porting, that is carrying something across the country or across state lines. Trans has a cross. So Transjordan means the area across the Jordan River from Israel. So Transjordan would be the area on this side of the Jordan. And so we see John Hyrcanus expands the kingdom over into that area, down to Idumea, down here, south of Judea, and then also into Samaria, up here. So initially we've got Israel. He expanded it over this way, down this way, and up this way.
High school teachers and students are officially calling off school tomorrow and using so please make sure you're taking all your books home with you so you can study extra long and hard over the next day and Thursday maybe up later. So officially tomorrow we will be closed. Thank you.
Now following, or as a part of this expansion into Idumea, John Hyrcanus did something kind of important. He started a policy of forced conversions, especially in Idumea, which at that point had become populated by people called the Edomites. I'll show you that and we'll come back. So people who were Edomites living over in Edom had migrated over to this area and became called Idumeans. So it's similar to Edom, Idumean. Now, do you remember who the Edomites were? Who was the ancestor of the Edomites? Do you remember, Matthew?
Esau.
Esau, very good. Remember Jacob and Esau, right? Esau is the father of the Edomites. Now, what kind of a relationship did the Edomites have with the Israelites? The descendants of Esau with the descendants of Jacob. Jacob is Israel. Didn't like them, yeah. In fact, when Moses was coming from Egypt and coming up through this area in order to go to the Promised Land, he asked the Edomites to let them through, and they refused. So they had to end up fighting them. All right? So these Edomites, traditional enemies of Israel, had moved over into this area. John Hyrcanus has come down and conquered this area. So what does he do with these Edomites? He forces them to abide by Jewish law. He forces them to become Jews. How does that usually work out when you force somebody to be converted? Doesn't work, does it? Because it's not really something from the heart, and it just causes people to rebel. All right, we keep that in mind. That's what he does. Okay, let's go back, and we'll see what else. He broke with the Pharisees and moved toward Hellenism. Now, again, you remember what the war was all about? It was not to become Hellenistic, right? Do you remember that? And yet, what do we find? The next generation is embracing Hellenism. Doesn't make sense, does it? But that's what they did. And John Hyrcanus was considered both prince and high priest. So he was both the political leader and the religious leader. All right, any questions so far? You getting the picture? So we had Simon started out ruling. His son John Hyrcanus became more and more Hellenistic and conquered lots of territory, forcing conversion of Idumeans. Okay, now let's go to the next guy then. After John Hyrcanus is a man by the name of Aristobulus. And if you look at the chart here, you can see here's John Hyrcanus and here's Aristobulus. He's the son of John Hyrcanus. So he follows his dad. He gained power however, or maybe because they consolidated his power by murdering his own mother. There's a nice family. That's not all. He also murdered 3 brothers. Such a nice man, don't you think, to have power over Israel. So he ascended to the throne, only he didn't say he was just a prince waiting for the Messiah. He declared himself to be king. So he's taken upon himself a lot more authority. And he expanded further into Galilee. Show you that, so you get that down. Galilee was made part of the Jewish kingdom. So, John Hyrcanus expanded down into Idumea, to Samaria, over here in Transjordan, and now Aristobulus expands further up into Galilee. So you can see they're gaining more and more territory all the time. But are they godly leaders? No, not at all. He also followed a policy of forced conversion, especially with the Itureans in the Golan Heights, which is up in here. Oops, there's an arrow to show you Galilee. I forgot I had the arrow on there already. And the final result is, looking at Aristobulus, there's the area of Iturea. I was off a little bit. I was pointing here. It's up there. Aristobulus was a brutal ruler. He was a nasty, nasty man. Well, as all other things, his rule finally comes to an end. And he is followed by Alexander Janicus, or sometimes it's spelled Janius. You see both ways. I have a Janicus here. Sometimes there's an E there. And you can see here's Aristobulus, and here's Alexander Janius, or Janicus. That's his brother. So he's another son of John Hyrcanus, the brother of Aristobulus. And he declares himself to be both king and priest. He also is known for his cruelty, follows in his father's footsteps, and he had a passion for war and expansion, so continues to expand the kingdom. And as things go with the other leaders, the Sanhedrin, of the Great Council, he sides with the Sadducees, who were also more Hellenistic, and went so far as to expel the Pharisees. Remember, the Pharisees were the ones that came out of the Hasidim, who were the original ones fighting against Hellenism, the ones who refused to fight on the Sabbath to begin with because they wanted to keep that day holy. The Pharisees are the ones that keep the law. They want to keep away from Hellenism, and they're expelled from the Sanhedrin. And that led to a Pharisaical revolt. They, and interestingly, they were the ones that have revolted against Syria, which is the area that was ruled by Antiochus Epiphanes, remember. They have revolted against Hellenism and against rule by Syria, but now when they're kicked out of the Sanhedrin, they actually go to Syria and ask them to help fight against Alexander Jannaeus. So they go to their former enemies and say, help us drive out this guy who has just kicked us out of the Sanhedrin. So they did. The Syrian forces invaded, and Alexander fled for 6 years. Well, do you think the Syrians were doing that out of the goodness of their hearts? No. No, they're planning to get something out of it, right? So once they help the Pharisees drive out Alexander Jannaeus, they start to try to take over. And the Pharisees didn't see that coming. You would have seen that coming, wouldn't you? You'd think. And so they start to try to take over. So the Pharisees decided we've got to get rid of the Syrians now. So they made peace again with Alexander Jannaeus and said, okay, we're going to make peace with you again to drive the Syrians out and get rid of them. And so Alexander Jannaeus came back. They pushed out the Syrians, and he regained the throne. So now everything is peaceful again. Alexander Jannaeus invited the Pharisees to a massive feast to celebrate the fact that the Syrians are gone and we have control over the land again. Everything looks great, right? You don't think so, Matthew? You think there's going to be a catch to all this? Yeah, exactly. At this feast to which he invites these Pharisees, he arrested and crucified 800 of them. Work against me, will you? He said. Well, under Alexander Jannaeus, the territorial control of Israel came to the same extent as under David and Solomon. So all that David and Solomon had conquered was conquered under Alexander Jannaeus as well. But things are not so rosy, and we'll find out more about it the next time we are together.